So, Donna, welcome to the Black and Raw podcast. It's really good to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's all right. And when I saw when someone reached out to me about you, I was like, oh, I think this would be someone who would be really interesting to read. And I was having a read of the book as well. I didn't get to finish it, but I was enjoying what I was reading up until that moment. It was very insightful.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
That's all right. So I just wanted to sort of get to know a little bit more about you and, your journey through California State University and what that's been like for you.
Yeah, so I actually was a student in the California State University. I got my bachelor's degree and master's degree, both in history and African American studies, one at Cal State University Fullerton, and then also at Cal State Long Beach before I went on to get my PhD in educational studies at Ohio State University. And so then I came back home and I've been faculty for almost 20 years in women and gender studies first for 10 years. I was the first woman of color to ever get tenure in women and gender studies at California State University Fullerton. And then I went to become the department chair for Africana studies at California State University Dominguez Hills. And I was the first woman to ever get promoted and tenured to full professor there. And now I'm an associate dean at California State University, Long Beach. And I'm also a professor of history. So I've been in the Cal State system since my youth and all the way through my career. And so that I think that's part of why I wanted to write this book.
And it sounds like you've been in the system since you were a student and then now going onto the board and being the first Black woman trustee. Like there's a lot of sort of firsts and a lot of, I guess milestones that you've made throughout. Were there things as a student that you saw in the board or just in the higher organization when you're like, that needs to change? Like, or where you're thinking, okay, if I get that, this is what I'm going to be doing?
Yeah, actually, I was a student activist while I was at Cal State Fullerton. It was at the height of kind of Afrocentrism in the states, and so I was really involved with trying to, increase the number of Black students that were enrolled in the university, trying to make sure there were services, scholarships, and so forth. But the big thing that we were fighting is that the erosion of affirmative action. And so I was a student in the 90s, in the early 90s, when the attack on affirmative action was really ramping up. And at that time, I didn't understand the power of the trustees. We didn't understand how much power they had over all the decisions that happen on campus. And the Cal State system, for your listeners that are unaware, is a 23 campus system. So it's a massive undertaking. And just trying to get the answer to one question you will get 23 different answers. And so as a student, just I didn't understand how things worked.
Mm.
And so when I went on to my master's degree, I took a deep interest in educational history because I didn't understand what was happening as an undergraduate student. And when affirmative action was finally eliminated in California, um, I knew that if we didn't learn about the trustees, we didn't learn about how the system worked, eventually affirmative action would go across the United States because California was always going to be that kind of bellwether or test case for everyone else. And sure enough, in 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court got rid of affirmative action full stop across the country.
Yeah, I was, when you were talking, I actually wanted to sort of bring that up in terms of like, is there any parallels that you've seen from being an activist on campus trying to fight for affirmative action, only now for the Supreme Court to strike it down? Like, what are some of your views on it as well?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court made this decision. Um, really, I think they made it on these kind of false pretenses. And what I mean by this is that the person who brought the case against Harvard University that got rid of affirmative action was a man by the name of Edward Blum. And he's what he calls himself is a legal activist. He has no legal training whatsoever. But what he does is he goes around and he kind of whips up a lot of hysteria against affirmative action,
Mm.
multiculturalism, and he gets paid by foundations, conservative foundations, to bring legal cases against um, universities, corporations, and so forth, the ones that are interested in DEI. And so Blum, this guy, claimed that there were Asian American students who were so angry about affirmative action at Harvard University. And when you look back through all of it, you find out that the Asian American students were like, "Hey, don't use us. We don't know what he's talking about. We've never had a
Yeah.
conversation with this guy."
Used as a scapegoat, weren't they, really?
Yes, and he more or less falsified his membership roster. So he brought this case on behalf of a group called Students for a Fair Admission, but no students from Harvard were actually on the list. There were students from other places, but
Um,
mostly it was just his conservative followers. And so part of my other research is conservative philanthropy. And so one of my articles was used in the amicus brief to support Harvard University fighting this man who was trying to get rid of affirmative action. So there's deep parallels between kind of what's happening in terms of student activism, even with the Israel Gaza issue, which, is complicated for a lot of reasons. There's parallels between student activism. There's no change that'll happen in a university without student activism.
yeah, you definitely need the people that are in the system as well to sort of, show their discontent. And I think a lot of us think that we don't have a lot of power in the things that we do, but collective action, I think, is one which we've seen time and time again that definitely does help change come along. And sometimes it seems slow, but I think you do see sort of consistent change throughout.
Yeah, I mean, universities are notoriously slow to change. However, um, if it wasn't for student activism and engagement, they would have never changed. It
Mm.
would have still been the province of wealthy white men if it hadn't been for student activism and engagement. And part of what students have to do is learn how the system works. And so part of me writing this book is to try to help unpack the the hidden hand, really, of university governance, which are the trustees. Most people don't know who they are, what they do. I didn't know the extent of their power when I was researching for this
Yeah.
book.
I was about to say, so what do they do? Because I think to be fair, I don't really know. I could just have a guess and say, do they make policies for the university? But like, how much power do they actually have in sort of changing the university? I don't know, whatever they want to change there.
So they're responsible, or they have the power over every appointment in the university, whether it's the president, whether it's a chancellor. If there is a faculty dispute, they could be the final arbiter on those faculty disputes. How much money is they get to set the tuition rates for everyone. They have enough power to go in if a student publication, like a student run newspaper, got any money from the university and someone wrote an article that the trustees didn't like, the trustees could get rid of it.
Wow.
So First Amendment rights be damned, because they have the final authority. And what's so interesting about trustees, boards of regents, boards of governors, is that most of the time they're lay people who have no understanding of how the university actually works. They don't know what a faculty member goes through or what a student experiences, but they
Mm.
make decisions on everything from how high to build a mound for art installation. They get to make those decisions. So there's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of very few people. And then to top it all off, the majority of board appointees are political appointees in this kind of political patronage system.
Yeah.
So in the states, governors have the ability over public institutions to name trustees based on people who might have been their campaign donors.
So it's not really a meritocracy or anything like that. It's more just who's your mates and do you get a
Yes.
nice cushion job?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that understanding that granular detail of how much power they have will equip students with how do you craft a campaign or how do you push back. But a lot of times, because students don't know, they're angry and upset, which they're rightfully so, but they don't know how to channel the anger, or they channel it toward, they find one person and it's like, no, it's a whole bunch of other people. There's a lot of layers before you kind of unravel the system.
Yeah. And I guess now that you are a part of the system, and that, as you're saying, a lot of these people don't even understand what the student experience is like, what faculty heads go through. As someone that does understand those things, and you're now within the system, how are you finding the challenge of bringing in that student voice, bringing in that activism side of you, but I'm sure you've got lots of competing interests when you're on the board, because you know that, okay, I know the students need to be at the forefront of what we do, but I don't know who's above or whoever decides whatever happens, but I'm sure they all have their own interests as well.
Yeah, so because I'm middle management, so I'm an associate dean, so I kind of serve at the pleasure of the president, but I serve the needs of the faculty and the students. So it's a tough balancing act for me to do. One thing that I say is my advantage is that I'm a Black woman, and I say this because I have an outsider within perspective that allows me to be in the system, but be critical of the system at the same time.
Okay.
So I don't walk into the system touting the system line without being critical about where the system has fallen short. And that perspective, I think, gives me an advantage, in so much as I can problem solve in ways that other people can't, because they can't imagine that the system treats people badly. They can't imagine that the system that they think is so such a meritocracy could actually have so many pitfalls along the way for a student.
Who would think, isn't it? Imagine.
And it is a tough balancing act, but I also, when I'm working with students, and one of my responsibilities is over the faculty. One is I talk to the faculty a lot. So I engage with them and build relationship with them so that I can kind of triage whatever problems that they're having. So in my role, because I'm over personnel and curriculum, I work directly with the department chairs, the faculty, and then I deal with any student complaints or problems. And I spend more time educating people about how the system is run. And then after they figure, they get that kind of education, then I say, look, this is the process to escalate if you feel, so maligned, or here's an alternative way to do things. So I think because of my positionality, and this is the parallel with the book I wrote about Claudia Hampton, that positionality allows me to see the world for what it is, as opposed to this kind of idealistic notion of how universities are run.
Yeah, you're bringing that sort of actual real perspective. And I guess we could say real perspective, but I do think it is a real perspective because you've been in both, you've been on both ends of the spectrum. And, as a Black woman, I can't imagine sort of what you faced coming through that. Um, I guess in terms of talking about that character, Claudia Hampton, um, and just sort of what is going on in the story, how would you say are the parallels that Hampton faced and those that Black women face in academia today?
Yeah, so I think the biggest parallel is that people presume Black women to be incompetent, and that Black women have to work harder, be more prepared. Um, there's also a loss of funding to public education. There's Those are the same things that was happening in the 70s and 80s that we're facing now. There's also the racial and gender microaggressions that we're facing. Claudia Hampton faced people calling her the N word in meetings. Um, and that's not too dissimilar from things that a lot of Black women who are faculty, who are staff, are experiencing. There's also an idea called cultural identity taxation. So, cultural taxation deals with Black men, women, whomever who experience this sort of taxation when they're in the institution. They're expected to answer all the diversity questions and, be the kind of diversity salesperson,
Yeah,
so
the
to
little expert, isn't it? Oh, you're
speak.
Black, you must know what's going on there. Totally,
Yes.
totally.
Yeah. And so, but there's no compensation for all of that extra work. There's no acknowledgement of it when you go up for evaluation. And then there's also identity taxation that deals with women, where women are expected to mother a student through a crisis. So the student will come to you and say, I'm pregnant and I want to get an abortion, but my family's against it. It's like, oh, okay. And so they come to you because they trust you. So when you
Yeah.
combine the two, cultural taxation and identity taxation, Black women are dealing with it on a different scale. And so Claudia Hampton was the person that everybody on the board relied on as the conciliator between factions on the board. So you had a liberal faction, you had a conservative faction, you had a moderate faction, and they all would come to her and say, could you help us? Could you help us get the thing that we want? Or we have a problem with the chancellor. Can you help us talk to the chancellor? And so she was mothering folks and expected to also be the affirmative action trustee, all in one person. And so, in many ways, she was like the instrument that kept the whole thing running.
But probably didn't get the credit for keeping
No,
the whole thing running.
no. In fact, what's so ironic about all of this is that there was a 6-hour interview that she conducted, or someone conducted with her, a part of a project for it's like a gubernatorial oral history collection, and everyone else that was interviewed has a bound um, interview that is in a library that you can find. Not Claudia Hampton. Hers, I found it at the bottom of a box
Wow.
and transcribed it and said, why isn't this one, like noted in the Library of Congress like all the other ones? And so that's part of why I wrote the book, is that no one has ever really known the extent of her impact on the system because it's been shrouded in mystery.
Can you tell us a bit about Claudia Hampton, without, I guess, revealing too much of what you've written?
Yeah. So she was the first Black woman trustee in the Cal State system. But before that, she was responsible for kind of managing the desegregation orders of Los Angeles Unified School District. She was the director of an office called Schools and Community Relations that would go in and triage race relation problems between, say, parents and principals and the school district. Um, she was a K-12 teacher. She taught elementary school for many years before she got into that leadership role. And then she went on to get a master's degree and her doctorate degree in education. And so she was probably one of the most highly educated trustees at the time. And just this little tidbit, because she had a doctorate, they had to put her full name um, on the record. So most of the records, if you were a woman, you
Mm.
would Mrs. whatever your husband's first and last name, even if you were
Oh,
on the
okay.
board. But
Yeah.
because she was a woman with a doctorate, they had to use Dr. Claudia Hampton. So she came into the board highly educated, highly experienced in working in education policy. And so all of those things were part of her preparation for this job. Plus, she was very active and engaged in the Black community. Um, she created a political action committee to help elect Black officials. She was very involved in her church and her sorority. She was on multiple community boards, and she lived and stayed in View Park, which is almost 98% Black neighborhood in Los Angeles. And so she was always centered and engaged in the Black community, but because she was entering into white spaces, she knew how to move within those
Between both.
spaces.
Yeah, yeah. That was sort
Mhm.
of a superpower as well to a certain extent.
Yes.
Um, And you know what? This is the first time me ever hearing of Claudia Hampton. And you know, well, I was born in Zimbabwe, but I've lived in the UK pretty much all my life.
Mhm.
I'm probably not really supposed to know about her, but then I'm sure there are others that are in California that probably benefited from her action who don't know about her.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Even I benefited from her.
yeah.
So when I was a master's degree student at Cal State Long Beach, uh, my second year, I think it was my second year in the program, I received a state university grant. And I said, "What? Okay, I'm not going to say no to free money."
Go on, might as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But come to find out, after I studied Claudia Hampton, she advocated for what was called a balanced fee policy because they were trying to increase student tuition, and she was very upset about it and said, well, if you are going to increase tuition, you have to increase the aid to students, to needy students. And I fell into that category. And so because of that, the chancellor created the state university grant program. And so I'm a direct beneficiary of Claudia Hampton's activism. And I worked at a campus, Cal State Dominguez Hills. They have a classroom named after Claudia Hampton with a portrait up, and only one person on that campus actually knew who she was.
Wow. So I'm glad you sort of written this book about about her because there needs to be more people that know about this.
Yeah.
Um, and it sounds like she was trailblazing, and it's kind of poetic because I feel like you are also trailblazing as well. So you're writing about a trailblazer while also trailblazing your own path too, which is just fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the in every position that I've had in the Cal State system, I've been the first, either the first woman or the first Black person. And so I saw the parallels between she and I in a lot of ways. But I also, when I first, found out about her, I was fixated on her being the first. And then I
Mm.
realized her being the first wasn't the only accomplishment. She did a lot with being the first. We often, at least in the States, I'm sure also in the UK, we use the first Black person to do something, the first woman to indicate some kind of progress.
Mm.
Like, oh, well, we elected Barack Obama, so now we're post-racial, and we over rely on the first and not the systematic change that needs to take place because you put somebody in a position. And
Yeah.
so I'm
Go on, sorry.
hoping, that with me trailblazing, that while I might be the first, I don't want to be the last.
Yeah, and I think putting things in place that help that not be the last. Hampton's legacy of the grant directly helping you means that you can be one of the first. And hopefully from your actions that there's going to be more, and it won't be the first, but hopefully it'll be a long line of amazing Black women, Black boys, being in positions where people tell them that they shouldn't be. And I love kicking doors down like that, to be fair. So
yeah, absolutely.
So I think in an environment that we are in today, the Supreme Court, deciding to get rid of affirmative action. I think we see a lot about race and identity, which I don't know. I feel like with social media, there's a lot of sort of misinformation, but then also a lot of scaremongering. And I'm just thinking in terms of Hampton's legacy, sort of what lessons we can learn from it, because I feel like the times that she was fighting in, it feels like history is repeating itself a bit, that we're sort of in that same place.
Yes, yeah, we've kind of come full circle on some of our worst impulses.
Mm.
And the thing that we didn't learn before that we haven't learned still is that we need to have more diversity in our trustee boards and where people are making decisions, particularly policy. Because you need to have someone who's kind of equity minded on the board in order to push through equity minded or impactful policy that will reach a broader audience. So that's one lesson, is that we need to diversify boards, and maybe we need to take away the governor's ability to appoint and have this be either an election for board members or some type of uh, group of people, a committee of people making board appointments, because that's too much power to concentrate in the hands of one person to make these kind of appointments of their cronies. So that's one thing that we haven't learned. The other thing that we have not taken advantage of, at least in the United States, is that we haven't utilized a thing called holistic review of student applications for college and university admission. And what that means is that we've over relied on SAT scores, school competitiveness rankings, and grade point average. And we've ignored, family income and or family circumstances. We've ignored the all of the barriers that students might have faced in order to get to college. We use that school competitiveness ranking, and it's based largely on how much money is flowing through your school district, and that impacts how your school is ranked. And so, some students are burdened by the fact that they grew up in a particular zip code.
Yeah.
And, or postcode for UK audience. And so you go to a less resource school. It's not your fault that you grew up in a neighborhood where you went to a less resource school, but that's your life outcomes are dictated by those sort of things. So we could change those sort of, those sort of things. The other lessons that Claudia Hampton kind of teaches us is that there is more than one way to approach a problem. And so what I mean by that is that, we have the student activists, and I would argue that they're more or less more on the radical political side of the spectrum. But we also have people who are liberal insiders. And because of social media, we're so dug into either side that we don't find some kind of way to come together. Like, and you might have the same goal, but it's like, oh no, I'm not messing with them because those people are too radical, or I'm not going to interact with them because those are Uncle Toms and those folks, are sellouts and things like that. And it's like, you want the same thing. If you want more Black students in higher education, why can't you get over your your differences to focus on that.
Yeah.
And so Hampton teaches us. She taught me, because I was raised in the Black radical tradition. She teaches us that we need to use everybody. It's all hands on deck.
Yeah. And I think that is something that is really missing in our society these days, isn't it? It's either you're conservative or you're Labour, or, you're conservative or you're a Democrat. Like, one thing which I do mention politics every now and then, even though Biden is too old to be president, I think his sort of style of working with both sides and wanting to get both sides to work, and what can we give you and what can we get to a point that we all want to get to, I think is admirable for him. But why can't that be applied to all the things that we do that need creative solutions? You know what I mean? Because yeah, you can't, if you're trying to get something done and the other person is against you, then it's going to be so much harder to do that thing without sort of trying to bring them in and figure out where your common ground can be.
Yeah. And I think the problem is more acute than just the two opposite poles. It's two sets of people who want the same thing, and they're fighting with each other about how to get the same thing.
Mm.
And it's like, well, at least we have the same value, that we want the same thing. So what can we do together to make that happen? So that before you even start to, let's just say, it's to get more resources into Black communities, instead of arguing with the conservatives, why don't all the people in labor join forces to work on that common goal?
Yeah.
But instead, what you find is that people will hide and say, well, I agree with them, but I don't really want to say it out loud.
Everyone's looking out for their own clout, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. Like what happened with Abbott, the MP, where the guy said something about Abbott with regards to Black women, and
Yeah, and I think she responded back with a Judaism sort of quote.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that
so
was,
that was like a really ugly display, right?
yeah,
And but you did not see labor come out forcefully enough and defend her when the first set of problems happened. And so it's like, well, I'm labor, and I'm looking behind me, and I don't see anybody having my back. And so how do you move forward when your own people are not supporting you?
yeah. That I think that definitely gets into a wider issue. And you'll have me here ranting on politics, so I'm gonna I'm gonna move on. But I do think there is a lot that we can learn from people, from Hampton, from you, that are in our higher education systems as well. And in terms of like your role as a Black woman educational leader, how are you trying to get equity within the university system?
Yeah, so I am, like I said, my job is for personnel and curriculum. And so my uh, one of the biggest challenges that I face is trying to diversify the faculty ranks to make sure that there are enough faculty who come from different backgrounds, different races, different religions, and so forth, so that that diversity can be reflected in the classroom. And so one of the biggest challenges that we face, because California got rid of affirmative action, is how do you diversify when you don't have a law that mandates diversity?
Mm.
And so it is a very hard challenge, but one that we can't just give up and throw our hands in the air. So one of the things that I've been pushing for is that the university goes out and does more outreach at academic conferences where you will find people of color. So I'm a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, one of the largest and oldest academic conferences or academic associations for African American historians. We have not gone to go those conferences and recruit faculty to come to California at at their annual meeting. So that's one small thing that could be done, is to go actively to go where people are.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. We haven't advertised like we should in diverse issues in higher education magazine and things like that. But also, we haven't really put structures in place to deal with what we call in the Cal State system conduct of concern. And conduct of concern is stuff that doesn't violate our the law, but it also sets up the conditions for people to leave. And so it's those behaviors where someone might call you articulate. It's like, I should be. I have a PhD. So why would you think that that was okay to say? And so there's a lot of kind of training that has to happen. And so that's part of my role. My other part of my job is to deal with a lot of conflict resolution between, department chairs and faculty, and teaching people how to respect people's expertise and their space, but to do it in a way that is at least professional, if not collegial.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. I just started this administrative role in January, and already I'm looking at, okay, so we can start a program to do this. We need to put these processes in place. We tried, but we're unsuccessful to do cluster hires around Black Long Beach, because we're in Long Beach. So how do we elevate issues and concerns for Black people who live in Long Beach? And so we had like 5 departments that wanted to come together and get faculty hires that were targeted, one in Black geography, one in Africana studies, one that would do Black religion, and so forth. And so if we brought people in as a cluster, the idea is that they would have ready-made support.
Amongst who they came in with.
And then we would pair them with the Black faculty who are already there, so they would have mentors and things like that. But because of state budget cuts, we didn't get that approval, but we're going to put in for that again next year. Hopefully the budget situation improves. And so things like that, coming up with, cluster hires as a way to help bring diversity into the university. Those are some of the things that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and those, and by the sounds of it, I think those would actually be really good in terms of bringing in those. Because, like, I remember being at university, and I think I had one Black lecturer, and it was like, oh, and when I was at school, I did go to a school in a predominantly white area, but I'm trying to think if I maybe had 1 or 2 Black teachers. I know, depending on if you were in London, you'd probably have a lot more. But in the area that I was, I'm sure there were people that were qualified Black teachers that maybe weren't getting the jobs in these places. And even at uni, I felt like I had to sort of defend my Black lecturer, because he was an all right lecturer. He never got through any of the material in one seminar. But there would always be something interesting to talk about. But I feel like I had to defend him because he was the only Black lecturer that I had. So I think you can see that within higher education. And I think it is important to have more Black lecturers, have more Black female lecturers, and people in positions of power, because they're going to give you a bit of hope in, like, okay, if I actually want to go into academia, I have someone that I can look at and be like, okay, I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I know for sure the UK is pretty abysmal with the number of Black lecturers. In fact, there's the Black British Studies Association, I believe. And their quote was something like, there's one in every 80, there's like only 1% of lecturers in any given moment are Black lecturers. And I was just like, ooh, this is pretty bad. And I lived in Manchester,
Mm.
England for a while. And I was helping my mother-in-law through chemotherapy, but I would go to University of Manchester for talks just because I just needed something else to do. And it was always so interesting how, um, I would be the only Black person visiting at these lectures, and none of the students there were very few students who were Black.
Mm.
There were absolutely no lecturers in that presentation that would be Black. And so we would listen to the talk and then we would go to a pub afterwards, right? And I said, I got a question. And they're like, oh, yeah. I said, Longsight, the predominantly Black area in Manchester, is right up the street. I'm curious, why don't you have more Black people on this campus? And particularly in your faculty, but you want to study racism in America?
I love that question.
And they were like, oh, uh,
Um,
yeah. I said, you have an American Studies program, and most of your projects have to deal with racism in the United States. And yet you are directly up the street from the largest Black population in Manchester, and you have no community engagement. You very rarely see any Black students walk across this campus, and you don't have any representation of Black people in your lecturer ranks. And so they were like,
that was
very,
stunned.
they were quiet and looking like, oh, we weren't ready for this question.
Yeah, we brought the wrong person over to start criticizing our race policies.
Yeah. And so, I went back the next time, and um, they stopped asking me questions about racism in America. Then it started to shift because I guess they all figured out, like, she knows how to ask questions.
That's why you have a PhD.
Yes, that's why I have a PhD.
That is crazy though, and I'm glad you asked that question of them, because I didn't even know Manchester was the university is that close to the predominantly Black area. That is crazy. I wonder if that's changed at all, to be honest with you, because Manchester as well is a very diverse city just in itself.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's interesting. That's very
Yeah.
interesting.
I was staying in Longside with my mother-in-law, and I would walk up the street, and like it went from Black and um yeah, it was mostly Black, and there were a lot of folks from Middle Eastern
Yeah.
origin. And then you would just walk up the street maybe half a mile, and it would just change. And it's like, oh, that's different. I said, oh, okay, yeah. So the surrounding, now this is University of Manchester. Manchester Metropolitan was more in the city, kind of toward the city center, so it was a
Yeah.
little bit different. But University of Manchester, it was like there was a ring around it to inculcate it from, the people of color.
I wonder if they ever listen to this episode. I wonder what they're gonna think. Um, I really, in terms of, I guess, the legacy of Claudia Hampton, her fight for affirmative action. What would you believe are sort of the most important steps that institutions and individuals can sort of do in, I guess, creating a more diverse and equitable higher education system?
So I think one of the easiest thing that universities can do is two things. Work, first of all, work in partnership with our elementary and secondary schools to make sure that they are advising Black students correctly on how to get admitted into the university. Now, we have very high school graduation rates for Black kids across the United States, but we have very low preparation for admittance into universities. Somewhere along the line, students are not getting the proper guidance on what courses they need to take to be eligible. So in California, for example, Black students, only about 60% of Black students who graduate from high school are eligible to enroll in the California State University or the other the other system, which is the University of California. So that's already put these students at a disadvantage. So that's one thing that can happen, is making sure, and I believe that there's some racism built into how these kids are tracked and put into classes that won't meet the eligibility requirements. Because if you look at other groups, like the Latinx community or the Asian American community, they have much higher eligibility for our public universities, even though we all graduate from high school at the same graduation rates. So there's that is one thing that can be done. The second thing that can be done, and the universities have to relinquish control in order for this to happen, is that because of affirmative action, you cannot earmark any scholarships based on race. You can't do any of those sort of scholarships or grants. But what can happen is there's community foundations where you can put money into a community foundation, and because they're privately held, they can earmark it for a particular racial group or women or whomever. And we haven't utilized those vehicles like we should. There's Cal State University Fullerton, where I went to undergrad and also taught. And in Orange County, California, there is a foundation there that's run by a Black woman. And they have a Black Excellence Fund and they have a Latino Higher Education Fund. And so there are vehicles by which we can make sure students don't incur a whole lot of debt in order to get their education. But universities would have to stop trying to hold on to the money and put it into the foundation so that it would be funneled to the students who actually need it.
Asking anyone to hold on to money is hard, especially people in power.
Yes. Yeah. And so if they redirected if some of the funds or some of the donors even gave directly to the foundations and said, I want this for Black students, I want this for, students on the autism spectrum, whatever it is, there could be a way in which you don't have to deal with the problem of not having affirmative action anymore.
Yeah. And you know what? I think a lot of these things, and I think we can see what's going on in higher education and in terms of diversity and inclusion, but I think also just the state of them, especially in the UK, I think a lot of our universities are running out of money. But at the same time, they're then trying to charge, they'll probably want to charge students even more for a product which isn't actually at, I guess, what you actually require, to be fair. So I think there are a lot of issues that are going on within our education system, and even how you were talking about before in terms of outreaching to the communities, but also empowering those that are young to be able to go to these higher education. So there's issues in sort of before higher education and even afterwards and during. So I think there's a lot, but I'm glad there are people out there like you that are bringing light to the situation and also within the institution trying to help it change.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
That's all right.
I do want to say this about Claudia Hampton. Claudia Hampton was a champion for Black students, but she didn't use Black radicalism in order to do it. She used what cultural theorist Homi Bhabha calls sly civility. And so sly civility is this idea that as a colonized person, you're entering into these predominantly white spaces and you are being civil with the colonizer in order to get the resources that the colonizer benefits from, and you give back to your own community. And so I think she's unique in a lot of ways because she was always focused on Black students, but she knew she had to kind of cozy up to the white people on the board in order to get entree into their, like informal networks. So she cooked dinner for the white men. She had beers with them. She'd have a cigarette with them. She'd send Christmas cards to their families and flowers to their wives. She did a lot of kind of social networking in order to be effective on the board. So when there were times when people did not want to fund affirmative action, they were like, "Oh, but we love Claudia.
Yeah.
Claudia cooked dinner for us, so let's go ahead and give her the funding that she wants." And I had a hard time when I first heard the recording and she was talking about all these things that she was doing. I was like, ugh.
Y'all doing much, man.
Yeah, you're doing way too much. Like I said, I was raised up in a Black radical tradition, and so I had a hard time with it until a couple of things happened. One, I started to teach an article about it was called The Pragmatic Idealism of Mary McLeod Bethune. It was a Black woman educator who merged Booker T. Washington's ideas with W.B. Du Bois' ideas. So this kind of moderate with radical, they kind of merged. She merged them together. But the second thing that happened is I went to a conference and they were talking about Black development, fundraising officers at historically Black colleges and how they used sly civility in order to get white donors to give to historically Black colleges. And when they said sly civility, I said, that's it. That's it. That's exactly what Claudia Hampton is doing. It's almost this kind of sleight of hand kind of thing where it's like, I am coming to you as a respectable Black woman. I'm moderate. My tone is soft. My dress is, perfect. And you love me because I play to the gender norms because I will cook for you.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, while you give me all those resources, I'm giving this stuff back to the Black community. And so once I realized the genius of her Black kind of pragmatism, I had to change my own understanding of you can do all of those things. You can be Black radical when you need to be.
Yeah.
You can be moderate when you need to be. And sometimes you might have to cook dinner for people. I probably won't cook dinner for anybody in order to get them. That's just not my style. But I can sit down and have a beer with somebody if necessary.
Yeah. What are the sly sort of civility things that you've had to do?
Oh my gosh. So many times when I was a department chair, so this is when I was at Cal State Dominguez Hills. When I first got there, I kept asking, the people in my department, like, how, what's your relationship with these folks, with the white folks? And they're like, it's okay, but they were suffering. The department at the time had really low student enrollment, low visibility on campus. And I knew from having been an administrator before I became faculty. So I had a couple years when I was university administration. I said, I need information. I need to know, where all the bodies are buried. I need to know what's going on. And so there was a faculty lounge on campus and they met every Wednesday and folks would just sit there and drink and talk. And so I think I was probably the first Black person that actually went there on a consistent basis. And so I would just go in there. Half the time I wouldn't even drink. I would just listen to folks and then
just absorb what's going on.
Yeah. And eventually it got to a place where I did this for about 2 or 3 months. And then all of a sudden you know, people started telling me, oh, this is how we put our department on the map. These are the tactics that we use. And so I started to listen to that, and we started to raise the profile of the department. The other thing is that when I would go into meetings, like committee meetings, I would know somebody because I went and had a glass of wine with folks,
Yeah.
and so I could get the resources that I needed. So I was able to get money to create a State of Black Los Angeles forum where we brought different leaders on in the community. I was able to get funding for those sort of things. Was able to help get funding for our Pan-African Global Trade Conference that we did, where we brought folks from the council generals from African nations to come in to help do trade agreements and things like that. So all of that had to do with me going to have some wine or beer at this lounge thing.
Yeah.
And so it really paid off. It paid a lot of dividends, and it helped to uh, I think it was my third or fourth year as department chair, we raised our student enrollment by almost 300%. The number of articles and books we were publishing, those were starting to get a lot of national and international attention. But a lot of that had to do with me just in the background, sitting there, absorbing
Yeah.
information from folks. Yeah.
So you learned a lot by adopting that sly civility sort of way, which I it's a good way to sort of look at it, because you have to be able to sort of fit in both worlds and sort of adapt in both to, extract what the gatekeepers of holding and give it back to the community.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it was purposeful. I did not go in there thinking, "Oh, I'm just going to help myself." I knew I needed to find out why our department was struggling with enrollments and things like that. I mean, there were paperwork that had been sitting on someone's desk for over a year that was preventing us from putting courses on the books so that students would enroll.
Wow.
So I knew I had to get that paperwork done as fast as possible. So I walked over and I stood there, talked to the woman, had a little brief conversation, gave her a little box of candy, and got my paperwork done that same day.
Nice.
That while it had been sitting for a year, prior to me coming on board.
That's crazy. That's honestly crazy. Just, I think you also realize that people are sort of just inherently selfish, and they like to be noticed. They like to be, asked questions about. And that you took an interest in their interests. So going to those meetings, taking that time, and Claudia Hampton making dinner, sending flowers to the wife. She knew how to schmooze, because sending flowers to the wife, then the wife is like, "Oh, Claudia's asking for something. Oh, you give it to her. She'll be fine."
Oh, and in fact, on that point, there is a scholarship called the Claudia Hampton Scholarship, Endowed Scholarship, and the wife of a white Republican conservative told her husband, "You need to create this scholarship before Claudia passes away." And he put down the seed money for this scholarship that still exists to this day. Because yeah, because she sent flowers and Christmas cards and asked about, the wives and stuff like that. They loved her. They loved her because she gave this personal touch to everything.
So, Dr. Donna Nicol, before we end, what are your hopes for the future of public higher education in regards to access, equality, and diversity?
I think my most immediate wish is that all of the talk about dismantling DEI efforts, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and getting rid of African American studies. My fondest wish right now is that those folks who have an issue with diversity and issue with Black folks learning about Black folks, or white folks learning about Black folks would actually stop and think about how utterly racist they sound. And the reason why I say this is because they're not targeting European American studies. They're not targeting any other ethnic group at this point. Uh, they're targeting Black folks. And why are Black people being used, continuing to be used as the whipping boy and girl for all of their racial anxiety? Because that's really what a lot of this is. There's this anxiety about the browning of America and this kind of this assumed loss of power and control. And so, going after diversity and saying, oh, well, you guys are teaching to hate white people. It's like, we have plenty to hate you about, but we don't.
Don't worry. We don't need education to hate you guys.
Yeah. We have plenty on its own, and we have not acted on any of that. So, it's not that we hate you. We hate the behavior that leads to our exclusion. And I think that, I guess my other wish beyond them, figuring out or hearing how racist they sound is that, really like kind of mind your business, like stay in your lane. If you don't want to take an African American studies class, don't take one. But please stop. Why would you want to shrink educational opportunities, instead of expanding them? The other thing that I would like to see is that there would be more people who learned about what affirmative action actually was, because there's a lot of mythology, and a lot of false information about what it was. In the United States, quota systems were outlawed in 1978. But people keep saying, oh, well, they had a quota system that set aside 10 places in the university for Black students. That was gone before 1980. What affirmative action does is that it ensures that you've given careful consideration to people and you don't hold them back because of their race. Like that you actually advertise in areas where there might be a concentration of Black students so that they can know that this opportunity is available to them. So, I had students I had a student sat in class when I taught last year and raised her hand and said, Dr. Nicol, we don't know what affirmative action is. And I just realized how old I was at that moment.
Excuse me, madam.
Like, can you explain what this is? And I'm like, oh no, that's the reason why because it came up on the California ballot again in 2022, and they voted against it because they didn't understand it. And I'm like, oh no. So a lot of education needs to happen about what affirmative action is and isn't. I think my biggest hope for public higher education is that the legislature actually funds higher education, because we keep getting these budget shortfalls that is resulting in us cutting back programs and initiatives that would help all students. Just recently in California, it came out yesterday, we're taking almost a 10% budget cut to all of the state schools. And that's going to have a tremendous negative impact it's going to put more students into a classroom, but there will be less sections of courses offered.
Yeah.
Or it's going to cut resources. Well. Yeah, all the resources, the library support, the instructional aids, and all of that, that's going to be cut. So, we can't talk about how much we value education and we don't fund it. We don't fund it adequately enough. California has the largest public higher education system in the United States, and yet we underfund it most of the time. And they'll say, well, it's because we have so many students. It's like, but there's 106 community colleges. You can send a lot of students there to start. and it's only $30 a credit hour. You can send them over there to begin their educational journey, and then they can transfer into the four-year institutions. We have 23 Cal States, and we have, 11 of the research institutions. So they give the most funding to the research institutions, even though they have the smallest numbers.
Yeah.
Makes no sense to me.
And even though the people that do the research got start from university as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the commitment to funding and supporting education, whether it's at the K-12 level or higher ed, that really needs to happen like post haste.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of sort of similar themes here, and we're across the pond right now, but I feel like a lot of those things can apply to the UK education system as well. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but I'm glad there are people out there like you that are working on wanting to achieve a better future for those that are in higher education and in education in general. So Dr. Donna Nicol, thank you for coming on to the Black and Raw podcast. Before we go, can you plug yourself, plug your book? Where can people find you? Where can people read about Claudia Hampton and see more of the fantastic work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Black Women on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action. You can find out more on my website at www.donnajnicol.com. There are audio links from old interviews with her. There's the information on the website on where you can purchase the book. It's available wherever you find, wherever books are sold. So you can just go directly onto my website and it will take you right there.
Bro. So website, you can find your book anywhere where books are sold. I'm going to put all the links into the show notes. So you guys, if you didn't hear that, just go into the show notes. You've got no excuses. Okay. I got you. So Donna, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.